A fratricide. It has been proved that the murder took place in the following way. Schmar, the murderer, stationed himself toward 9 p.m. in the moonlit night at the corner where Wese, the victim, had to turn from the street where his office was into the street he lived on. Cold night air sending shudders through everyone. But Schmar was wearing only a blue suit. Furthermore, his jacket was unbuttoned. He felt no cold. Besides, he was constantly moving. He kept a tight grip on his murder weapon, half bayonet, half kitchen knife, fully exposed. He peered at the knife against the moonlight. The blade flashed. Not enough for Schmar. He banged it against the pavement bricks, striking sparks. Regretted it, perhaps, and to fix the damage he drew the blade over the soles of his boots like a violin bow, while, standing on one leg and leaning over, he also listened to the grinding of the knife on his boots, though alert to any sound from the fateful side street. Why was all this tolerated by Pallas, a private citizen, who was nearby, watching everything from his window on the second landing? Try and fathom human nature. With his collar turned up, his dressing-gown belted around his wide waist, he peered down, shaking his head. And 5 houses further on, cater-corner from his house, Mrs. Wese, her fox fur over her nightgown, was peering out for her husband, who was taking an unusually long time today. At last the bell on the door of Wese's office rings, too loudly for a bell on a door, across the city, up to the sky. And that is where Wese, the diligent night worker, still invisible in this street, heralded only by the bell signal, emerges from the house. Instantly the pavement counts his quiet steps. Pallas leans out far. He must not miss anything. Mrs. Wese, reassured by the bell, shuts the clattering window. But Schmar kneels down. Since he has nothing else exposed, he presses only his face and hands against the stones. Where any other person freezes, Schmar burns. Wese halts precisely at the borderline separating the 2 streets. He only props himself on his cane into the next street. A whim. The nocturnal sky has enticed him, the dark blue and the gold. Unknowing, he glances at it. Unknowing, he runs his hand through his hair beneath the raised hat. In the sky nothing forms a pattern as an omen of his imminent future. Everything remains in its absurd, unfathomable place. It is actually quite sensible of Wese to keep walking, but he walks into Schmar's knife. "Wese!" shouts Schmar, standing on tiptoe, his arm outstretched, the knife sharply lowered. "Wese! Julia is waiting in vain!" And Schmar stabs to the right into the throat, and to the left into the throat, and the third thrust deep into the belly. Water rats, slit open, emit a sound similar to Wese's. "Done," says Schmar, and hurls the knife, the superfluous blood-stained ballast, against the nearest house front. Bliss of murder! Relief, ecstasy at the flowing of another man's blood. Wese, old nightshade, friend, beer-house crony, oozing out into the dark ground of the street. Why aren't you simply a bladder filled with blood so I could sit on you and you would vanish altogether? Not everything comes true. Not every dream that blossoms bears fruit. Your heavy remains lie here, already impervious to any kick. What's the point of the tacit question you are thereby asking? Pallas, chaotically choking down the poison in his body, stands in his 2-winged front door, which flies open. "Schmar! "Schmar! Everything's been noticed. Nothing's been overlooked." Pallas and Schmar peruse one another. Pallas is satisfied. Schmar reaches no conclusion. Mrs. Wese, flanked by a crowd, dashes over with a face thoroughly aged by terror. The fur coat opens. She collapses upon Wese. Her night-gowned body belongs to him. The fur, closing over the couple like the lawn over a grave, belongs to the crowd. Schmar, barely stifling the last of his nausea, pressing his mouth into the shoulder of the policeman, who, stepping lightly, takes him away. A dream. Joseph K. was dreaming. It was a beautiful day, and K. wanted to go on a walk. But no sooner had he taken a few steps than he was already at the graveyard. Its paths were highly artificial, impractical in their windings, yet he glided along such a path as if hovering unshakably over raging water. From far away he spotted a freshly dug burial mound at which he wanted to halt. This burial mound exerted an almost enticing effect on him, and he felt he couldn't get there fast enough. At times, however, he could barely glimpse the mound. It was covered with flags that twisted and flapped powerfully against one another. The flag-bearers could not be seen, but there appeared to be great rejoicing. While his eyes were still riveted in the distance, he abruptly saw the burial mound next to the path, indeed almost behind him by now. He hastily leaped into the grass. Since the path continued rushing along beneath his feet as he leaped off, he staggered and fell to his knees right in front of the mound. 2 men were standing behind the grave, holding a headstone between them in the air. The moment Kay showed up, they thrust the stone into the earth, and it stood there as if cemented to the ground. Instantly a 3rd man emerged from the bushes, and Kay promptly identified him as an artist. He was wearing only trousers and a misbuttoned shirt. A velvet cap was on his head. In his hand he clutched an ordinary pencil, drawing figures in the air even as he approached. He now applied this pencil to the top end of the stone. The stone was very high. He didn't even have to lean down, but he did have to bend forward, since he didn't wish to step on the burial mound which separated him from the stone. So he stood on tiptoe, steadying himself by propping his left hand against the surface of the stone. Through some extremely skillful manipulation, he succeeded in producing gold letters with that ordinary pencil. He wrote, "Here lies..." Each letter came out clean and beautiful, deeply incised and in purest gold. After writing those 2 words, he looked back at Kay. Kay, who was very eager to see what would come next in the inscription, gazed at the stone, paying little heed to the man. And in fact the man was about to continue writing, but he couldn't. Something was hindering him. He lowered the pencil and turned to Kay again. This time Kay looked back at the artist, who he noticed was very embarrassed, but unable to indicate the reason for his embarrassment. All his earlier liveliness had vanished. As a result, Kay likewise felt embarrassed. They exchanged helpless glances. There was some kind of awful misunderstanding between them, which neither of them could clear up. To make matters worse, a small chime began tinkling inopportunely from the tomb chapel, but the artist waved his raised hand wildly, and the chime stopped. After a brief pause, it started in again, this time very softly, and then promptly breaking off with no special admonition from him. It was as if it merely wanted to test its own sound. Kay was inconsolable about the artist's dilemma. He began to cry, sobbing into his cupped hands for a long time. The artist waited for Kay to calm down, and then, finding no other solution, he decided to keep writing all the same. His first small stroke was a deliverance for Kay, but the artist obviously managed to execute it only with utmost reluctance. Moreover, the penmanship was not as lovely. Above all, it seemed to lack gold. The stroke moved along pale and unsteady. Only the letter became very large. It was a J. It was almost completed. But now the artist furiously stamped 1 foot into the burial mound, making the dark soil fly up all around. At last Kay understood him. There was no time left to apologize. With all his fingers he dug into the earth, which offered scant resistance. Everything seemed prepared. A thin crust of earth had been set up purely for show. Right beneath it a huge hole with sheer sides gaped open, and Kay, flipped over on his back by a gentle current, sank into the hole. But while, with his head still erect on his neck, he was welcomed down below by the impenetrable depth, his name, with tremendous embellishments, rushed across the stone up above. Enraptured by this sight, he woke up. A report for an Academy. Honored Gentlemen of the Academy, you have accorded me the honor of asking me to submit to the Academy a report on my previous apish life. Unfortunately, I am unable to comply with the terms of your request. Almost 5 years separate me from my apehood, a period that is perhaps short if measured on the calendar, but infinitely long when one gallops through it, as I have done, accompanied for stretches by excellent people, advice, applause, and orchestral music, yet basically alone. For in order to remain in the picture, anyone accompanying me kept far away from the barrier. My achievement would have been impossible had I wished to cling obstinately to my origin, to the memories of my youth. Indeed, renouncing all obstinacy was the supreme commandment that I imposed on myself. I, a free ape, knuckled under to this yoke. As a result, however, my memories were closed off more and more. While initially I had the choice, should people have wanted it, of returning freely through the full gateway that the sky forms over the earth, that self-same gateway, as my development was whipped forward, simultaneously became ever lower and narrower. I felt more comfortable and more thoroughly included in the human world. The storm that blew after me from my past calmed down. Today it's merely a draught that cools my heels, and the distant aperture through which it passes and through which I once passed has grown so small that even if I had sufficient strength and desire to run back that far, I would have to flay the very hide from my body to squeeze through. Frankly, much as I like to use images for these things, your apehood, gentlemen, insofar as you have anything of that nature behind you, cannot be more remote from you than mine from me. Yet anyone who walks here on earth feels a tickling in his heel, from the small chimpanzee to the great Achilles. In its most restricted sense, however, I may be able to reply to your inquiry after all, and I even do so with great delight. The first thing I learned was how to shake hands. A handshake attests to frankness. Although now that I am at the peak of my career, that first handshake may have been joined by frank speech. It will probably contribute nothing essential for the Academy, and fall far short of that which has been asked of me, and which I cannot convey, try as I might. But still in all, it ought to show what guidelines a former ape has observed when penetrating the human world and establishing himself here. Yet I could not articulate even the following insignificant information if I were not utterly sure of myself, and if my position were not consolidated and unshakable on all the major vaudeville stages of the civilized world. I come from the Gold Coast. In regard to how I was captured, I must rely on reports by others. One evening, a safari of the Hagenbeck Zoo Company — incidentally, I have since drained many a good bottle of red wine with the leader — was lurking in the underbrush along a watering hole when I ran over to its bank in the midst of a herd of apes. They fired. I was the only one hit. I got 2 wounds. One in the cheek. It was light, but left a large, red, naked scar, which has earned me the repulsive, thoroughly inappropriate name, which only an ape could have come up with, of Red Peter, as if the red spot on my cheek were all that distinguished me from that locally popular trained ape animal Peter, who recently died. I mention all that merely in passing. The second bullet lodged below my hip. The wound was severe. It still causes me to limp slightly today. In a recent essay by one of the 10,000 news hounds that carry on about me in newspapers, I read that my ape nature is not yet fully suppressed, the proof being that whenever I have company, I always take down my trousers to show the entry point of the bullet. That scoundrel should have every finger of his writing hand blasted off one by one. I have the right to take down my trousers in front of anyone I care to. People will find nothing there but a well-groomed fur and the scar left, to avoid any misunderstanding, let us choose a specific word for a specific purpose, the scar left by a heinous shot. Everything is open and straightforward. We have nothing to hide. When it comes to plain truth, great minds will shed the very finest of manners. If, on the other hand, that pen-pusher were to take down his trousers for visitors, he would be cutting a very different figure, and I am willing to view it as a sign of his good sense that he refrains from doing so. But by the same token, let him stay out of my hair with his delicacy of feeling. After those shots, I awoke, and this is where my own recollection gradually begins, inside a cage in the steerage of the Hagenbeck steamer. The cage did not have 4 sides. It consisted of only 3 sides and was attached to a crate which formed the 4th wall. The structure was too low to stand up in and too narrow to sit down in. I therefore had to crouch with bent knees that constantly trembled, and since at first I probably wanted to see no one and remain in the dark, I kept facing the crate while behind me the bars sliced into my flesh. People see an advantage in keeping wild beasts like that during their early confinement, and today, after my own experience, I cannot deny that this is truly the case from a human point of view. But back then it never crossed my mind. For the first time in my life, I had no way out. At least I could not move forward. Right in front of me was the crate, board joined solidly to board. Between the boards, of course, there was a continuous gap which, upon first discovering it, I hailed with the blissful howling of ignorance. However, this gap was not wide enough for me to slip even my tail through it, nor was I able to widen it with all my apish strength. Supposedly, as I was later told, I made unusually little noise, which led them to conclude that I would either die soon, or, if I managed to survive the initial critical period, become highly trainable. I did survive that period. Dull sobbing, painful flea-picking, tired licking of a coconut, banging my skull against the crate wall, sticking my tongue out at whoever approached, those were my first activities in my new life. But in all those things, all I felt was no way out. Today, naturally, I can use only human words to depict my then ape-like feelings, and therefore I merely distort them. But while I may be unable to capture the old ape truth, then it at least lies in the direction I have indicated. Of that there can be no doubt. Previously I had had so many ways out, and now I had none. I was stuck. My freedom of movement would not have been further reduced even had I been nailed to the spot. Why? You can scratch the flesh raw between the toes on your feet, but you will not find the reason. You can squeeze your back against the bar until it almost slits you in half, but you will not find the reason. I had no way out, but I had to find one, for I could not live without it. Always up against that crate wall, I would have unquestionably died. However, for the Hagenbeck Zoo Company, apes belong up against the crate wall. Well, so I had to stop being an ape. A fine, lucid train of thought, which I must have somehow concocted with my belly, for apes think with their bellies. I fear that people may not understand exactly what I mean by a way out. I am using the term in its fullest and most widespread sense. I am deliberately avoiding the word freedom. I don't mean that grand sense of freedom on all sides. As an ape I may have been familiar with it, and I have met human beings who yearn for it, but for my part, I did not want freedom then, nor do I want it now. Incidentally, human beings all too often deceive themselves about freedom. And just as freedom is considered one of the most sublime feelings, the corresponding disillusion is likewise one of the most sublime. Often, while waiting to go on for a vaudeville performance, I have watched some pair of acrobats fiddling about on trapezes under the ceiling. They swung, they rocked, they leaped, they floated into each other's arms, one carried the other by clenching his hair in his teeth. This too is human freedom, I thought to myself, high-handed motion. You mockery of holy nature, no theatre could hold out against the laughter of apery at this sight. No, it was not freedom I wanted, just a way out, right, left, wherever. That was all I demanded. Let the way out be a mere delusion. My demand was small. The delusion would be no greater. Keep going, just don't stand still with raised arms squeezed against a crate wall. Today I can see clearly. Without utmost inner calm I could never have escaped. And indeed I may perhaps owe everything I have become to the calm that took hold of me after my first few days in the ship. And that calm I owed in turn to the crew of the ship. They were good people, despite everything. Even today I fondly recall the sound of their heavy steps, which echoed in my drowsing. Those men were in the habit of tackling everything very slowly. If one of them wanted to rub his eyes, he would lift his hand like a suspended weight. Their jokes were coarse but hearty. Their laughter always had a bark to it, which sounded dangerous but was of no significance. Their mouths always had something to spit out, and it made no difference to them where they spit. They always griped that my fleas jumped over to them, yet they were never seriously angry at me for that. They simply knew that fleas thrived in my fur, and that fleas are jumpers. They accepted it. If they were off duty, a few of them would sometimes gather around me in a half-circle, barely speaking, just grunting at one another, stretching out on crates and smoking their pipes, slapping their knees if I so much as stirred, and every so often one of them would take a stick and tickle me in a pleasant place. Were I to be invited to sail on that ship today, I would certainly decline the invitation, but it is equally certain that not all the memories haunting me in steerage would be ugly. More than anything else, it was the calm I acquired among those men that kept me from attempting any escape. In retrospect, it strikes me that I must have had at least an inkling that I ought to find a way out if I wanted to live, but that this way out could not be found by escaping. I no longer know whether escape was possible, though I believe it was. For an ape, escape should always be possible. The way my teeth are today, I have to be careful even when doing something as ordinary as cracking nuts. But back then, I would no doubt have eventually succeeded in chewing through the lock on the door. I did not do so, and what would have been gained by it anyhow? No sooner would I have poked my head out than I would have been recaptured and locked up in an even more awful cage. Or else, unnoticed, I could have fled to other animals, perhaps the giant pythons across the hold, to perish in their embraces. Or I might even have managed to steal all the way up to the deck and leap overboard. Then I would have bobbed up and down in the ocean for a while and finally drowned. Desperate acts. I did not reckon in such human terms, but under the influence of my milieu I behaved as if I were reckoning. I did not reckon, but I did observe at leisure. I watched those men going back and forth, always the same faces, the same movements. It often looked to me as if there were only one man. And this man or these men were going about unhampered. A lofty goal beckoned. No one promised me that if I were to become like them the cage door would be pulled up. Such promises in return for seemingly impossible achievements are not given, but if one succeeds in doing the impossible, then the promises belatedly appear in the very place where one sought them earlier to no avail. Now there was nothing particularly enticing about those men. Were I an adherent of the above-mentioned idea of freedom, I would certainly have preferred the ocean to the way out that emerged in the dismal gazes of these human beings. But in any event, I had been observing them for a long time before I ever thought of such things. In fact, it was my accumulated observations that first pushed me in this specific direction. It was so easy imitating these people. I already knew how to spit on the very first day. We would then spit into one another's faces. The only difference was that I would lick my face clean afterwards, and they would not. I soon smoked a pipe like an old-timer, and when I then actually pressed my thumb into the bowl of the pipe, the whole crew shouted with glee. The only thing I was in the dark about for a long time was the difference between an empty and a stuffed pipe. My worst trouble was with the liquor bottle. The smell was agonizing. I forced myself with all my strength, but weeks went by before I overcame it. Strangely enough, the crew took my inner struggles more seriously than anything else about me. I cannot tell the men apart in my memories, but there was one who kept coming back. Alone or with friends, by day, by night, at any hour, he would station himself in front of me with the bottle and give me lessons. He did not understand me. He wanted to solve the enigma of my being. He would slowly uncork the bottle, and then peer at me as if checking whether I had understood. I confess that I always watched him with rash vigilance. No human teacher would find such a human student anywhere on earth. After uncorking the bottle, he would lift it toward his mouth, I peering all the way into his throat. He would nod, satisfied with me, and put the bottle to his lips. I, entranced with my gradually dawning knowledge, would squeal and scratch the length and breadth of my body, wherever. He rejoiced, put the bottle to his lips, and took a swallow. I, desperately impatient to emulate him, soiled myself in my cage, which in turn gave him great satisfaction. And now, holding the bottle far away and then swinging it to his mouth while leaning backwards, the more vividly to instruct me, he would drain it at one swig. I, worn out with overpowering desire, could no longer follow him, and I hung limply on the bars while he ended the theoretical instruction by grinning and rubbing his belly. And now the practical training began. Was I not already utterly exhausted by theory? No doubt, utterly exhausted. That was part of my fate. Nevertheless, I reached for the proffered bottle as well as I could, trembling as I uncorked it. With each success, new energy gradually developed. Barely differing from the original model by now, I lifted the bottle, put it to my lips, and hurled it away in disgust. In disgust, even though it was empty and filled only with the smell, hurled it to the floor with disgust. To my teacher's sorrow, to my own greater sorrow. Nor did I placate him or myself by remembering, after hurling the bottle away, to rub my belly superbly and grin while doing so. All too many lessons unfolded like that. But to my teacher's credit, he was never angry at me. Granted, he sometimes put the burning pipe to my fur until some area that I could barely reach began to smolder, but then he would put it out himself with his own kind, gigantic hand. He was never angry at me. He realized that the two of us were on the same side, fighting against my apish nature, and that mine was the harder task. And then, what a victory it was, both for him and for me, when one evening, in front of a large group of spectators, they may have been having a party, a gramophone was playing, an officer was sauntering among the men, when that evening, in an unobserved moment, I grabbed a liquor bottle left inadvertently near my cage, uncorked it, as I had been taught, amid the growing attention of the company, put it to my mouth, and now, not hesitating, not twisting my lips, an expert drinker, with roundly rolling eyes, a sloshing throat, I really and truly drained it, tossed it away no longer as a desperate creature, but as an artist. I did forget to rub my belly, but instead, because I had no choice, because it got the better of me, because my senses were reeling, I curtly exclaimed, "Hey!" breaking out in human sounds, plunging into human society with that cry, and feeling its echo, "Listen, he's talking," like a kiss over my entire sweat-soaked body. I repeat, it did not entice me to imitate human beings. I imitated because I was seeking a way out, and for no other reason. Besides, little was accomplished with that victory. My voice instantly failed. It took months for it to come back. My repugnance toward the liquor bottle grew even more intense. My direction, though, was established once and for all. When I was handed over to my first trainer in Hamburg, I soon recognized the two possibilities that were open to me: zoological garden or vaudeville. I did not waffle. I told myself, do anything you can to get into vaudeville. That is the way out. The zoological garden is merely another barred cage. Once you're in it, you're doomed. And I learned, gentlemen. One learns if one must. One learns if one wants a way out. One learns relentlessly. One supervises oneself with the whip. One mangles oneself at the least resistance. My ape nature, rolling head over heels, rushed out of me and away, so that my first tutor almost turned apish himself in the process, soon gave up teaching, and had to be carted off to a mental hospital. Luckily he was soon released. But I went through many tutors, indeed even several at once. As I grew more confident of my abilities, with the public following my progress, and my future beginning to look bright, I engaged tutors myself, had them sit in 5 successive rooms, and learned simultaneously from all of them by leaping incessantly from room to room. That progress, that penetration of my awakening brain by rays of knowledge from all sides, I do not deny it made me happy. But I also admit that I did not overrate it, certainly not back then, and how much less today. By dint of a strenuous effort which has never been repeated on this earth, I have achieved the average education of a European. This may be nothing in itself, but it is something inasmuch as it helped me out of the cage, opening up this special way out, this human way out. There is a marvelous German idiom, to slink off into the bushes, meaning to see something through. And that was what I did. I slunk off into the bushes. There was no other way, so long as I could not choose freedom. In surveying my development and what I have achieved so far, I neither complain nor am satisfied. With my hands in my trouser pockets, my bottle of wine on the table, I half lie, half sit in the rocking chair and gaze out the window. If a visitor comes, I receive him as is proper. My personal manager sits in the vestibule. If I ring, he comes and listens to what I have to say. I perform almost every evening, and my triumphs could hardly be greater. When I come home late at night from banquets, from scientific societies, from social get-togethers, a small, half-trained female chimpanzee is waiting for me, and I have a good time with her in apish fashion. By day I do not want to see her, for she has the madness of the confused, trained beast in her eyes. I alone recognize it, and I cannot endure it. In any case, I have, all in all, attained what I set out to attain. Let no one say it was not worth the bother. Besides, I am not intent on any human verdict. I only want to spread knowledge. I only report. For you too, honored gentlemen of the Academy, I have only reported.